Thank you, Annie. Thank you, Jeff and Ethan, for sharing your thoughts with us. And we're next moving into session 4, reminding all speakers that we have a roundtable at 12 o'clock. So session 4 is more squarely focused on the UN SDGs. And to do so, we have selected and are happy to have 2 distinguished participants. One is Raymond Zainer in Switzerland. And I have to tell you that we actually pre-taped his presentation because he was catching a plane from DC Dulles Airport to Geneva on Monday night, and the plane was delayed by a day. So he flew last night, and there he is live. So we will not need his videotape presentation, which we taped at Dulles. And then Max Bouchet. Before I introduce them properly, let me make a few preliminary quick remarks. Let me say that in 2015, recall, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was agreed upon by the world's government. By 2015, 20 countries had already reported to their peers their initial efforts to implement 17 goals. Subsequently, follow-up national reviews took place every year, for most countries, that is. And for a short lapse, you may or may not recall, the United States was not a party anymore to the Paris Accord, but rejoined the process last year. The reporting on progress made towards achieving the ambitious UN SDG Sustainable Development Goals, all 17 of them, is done by reporting to the high-level Forum on Sustainability, the HLPF. And I note that Raymond, our friend from Switzerland, is involved in that process, so perhaps he can tell us a little more. But clearly, the role of information and reporting is central, not only for NGE and governments, but also for corporations. And in that regard, the establishment of public-private partnerships, which Max will talk about, provides additional information to be fed into the reporting loop. Our 2 guest speakers address these aspects and responsible business conduct and provide examples of creative PPP, otherwise known as public-private partnerships. Therefore, the challenge is one of scaling up sustainability reporting. Without information, we really do not know where we are. Not just increasing the amount of available data, but increasing the quality and the usefulness of the data. I note that SDG target 12.6, for those of you who follow the SDGs, call for governments to monitor how many companies have issued sustainability reports. One such example is the GRI that was created early on, and it has provided CSR reporting since the late 1990s. Another one very commonly used in the United States is the TCFP, Task Force on Climate Reporting Financial Disclosures, established in 2015, and it's a voluntary climate-related financial risk disclosure. Another such is the Carbon Disclosure Project, the CDP, which provides an opportunity for about 15,000 organizations to disclose their environmental information through the CDP. Finally, another one commonly used in the United States for good reason is reporting through the Dow Jones Sustainability Indices, and that was established in 1999 before actually the UN SDGs. And the Dow Jones Sustainability Indices is a family of indices evaluating sustainability performance of the firm. One of our previous speakers mentioned the importance of reporting to the United States SEC, which applies to public firms in the United States, whether they are international firms or domestic firms. So we are a long way from having the necessary level of reporting on sustainability as we move towards 2030. Bear in mind, there are 65,000 multinational companies, not even talking about medium and small-sized companies. They control 500,000 subsidiaries. Very few of them report actually or have sustainability reports. Increasingly so, but it's not certainly the majority. Therefore, it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to first Raymond Zainer. We will be presenting live. Now, let me say a few words about Raymond. Raymond is a tenured professor at Basel University in the economics department. He also teaches at Lüneburg University. He is the co-founder of CSEND, C-S-E-N-D, a Geneva-based non-governmental organizations accredited with the United Nations Economic and Social Council. And he is definitely the lead scholar on what is known as business diplomacy, the role of corporate structures in practicing diplomacy. He is the author of numerous publications and a well-known and respected expert in that area. I will defer in presenting Max when Raymond is done with his presentation. Raymond, the floor is yours. You have about 20-25 minutes.
Well, most of all, thank you, first of all, for the kind introduction. John, I just wanted to ask a technical question. Will the slides be shown from your side or on my side? Because I didn't click on it and I see already my first slide. If that's easier, then I can.
I'm moving your slides.
I believe Annie will show the slides, but what do you have a preference?
No, it's fine. If that's already set up that way, why not go like that?
Yeah, is that okay, Annie?
Yes, yes.
Very good. Let's proceed thus.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Well, first of all, I'd like to say hello to everybody who is listening to us, and I very much listened to what my two previous speakers who presented what's happening at the companies Cox and Cantaloupe. It's wonderful to hear all this innovation, which is increasingly possible, and it will help us move towards a more sustainable and more reasonable future. I think you all also agree that the two of you who presented the two companies are not necessarily the typical average US company. We have to figure out a way how to get everybody else on board so they could follow your example, and we would have really, in that sense, a substantial change towards a better future. Just two examples that I'd like to share with you, which in a way frames my presentation. One is the company Shell. Shell had to go to court in 2019 in the Netherlands. There were seven international NGOs and 17,000 Dutch citizens which asked Shell to come to court and explain why they don't reduce their CO2 emissions more drastically. At the end, Shell, for the Netherlands only, not at the international level, but for all their operations in the Netherlands, accepted to reduce by 45% its CO2 emissions in the Netherlands compared to the 2019 level. Now, this is only possible, mind you, because the Dutch passed a law at the national level, which says that the Netherlands want to implement the Paris Agreement, and that includes also companies. So laws can play an important role, as was the case in the Netherlands. On a bit sadder example is the CEO of Danone, a big French food transnational company, Emmanuel Faber, who was ousted on the 19th of March of last year by a so-called activist shareholder group who wanted to remind everybody else of the shareholding community what Professor Friedman once said many years ago, that business is about business and nothing else. In other words, they accused Emmanuel Faber of doing too much corporate social responsibility, which reduced the profit that the company otherwise would have been able to generate, and hence the shareholders got chipped of what the dividends could have been had he not done the corporate social responsibility projects. So in other words, I'd like just to say, we have to maybe take into account several other issues to get us all on board. Let's say those companies that are innovative and know and see the benefit of doing a more sustainable approach, as well as the laggards or those who resist to join us in making the world a more safe and a more reasonable place. Next one. So I'd like to also broaden our discussion and include a focus on the emerging economies and particularly on the low-income developing countries and the least developed countries. As you probably would agree with me, if they cannot be supported in their effort to implement the SDGs, we will not be able to have a real lasting change at the global level. So here is a study I'd like to cite by Vitor Gaspar, who works at the IMF with some of his colleagues. And this was a study before the COVID pandemic hit us in 2019. They estimated that the emerging economies, India, China, Brazil, for instance, if they were to go about really and implement the SDGs, it would about cost them or be the equivalent to 4% of their GDP. Doable. However, the others in red, the low-income developing countries, and again, particularly the least developed countries, that will be about, according to their estimation, 15% of their GDP. Now imagine in the US, if the US government would put 15% of its budget for SDGs and green issues, it would never pass. And here we have countries, actually about 40 of them are heavily indebted. They might not be solvent in the coming months. So when everything gets to be less money, less support, less possibilities in terms of getting food because of the war in Ukraine, of course, to some extent, there is the risk that SDGs are put second or third in our government's budgeting. Next one. So overall, be it developed or developing countries, this graph goes back already quite some years from the OECD, I think helps us discuss how do we finance and how do we want to go about financing infrastructure development. As you know, we make a distinction between physical infrastructure and social infrastructure. The physical one, that's telecom, roads, harbors, water. Social is more education. It is also hospitals, health, and some social services. Now, all countries need to continuously improve their infrastructure, both physical and social. How to finance it? Here are the options according to the graph that we have here in front of us. One could imagine all of that is done by the government. In other words, it's government financed and government executed. Or it's done through public procurement, where the government still pays, but private sector actors participate and they do more of the actual delivery of the doing than the government. We could have PPPs, and I will say more about the private-public partnerships. It could be through concessions. For instance, if we have a company build a highway, then a PPP could be that the company for 20 years can collect money through the toll booths, or not, or less. Or straightforward privatizations. Privatizations, of course, could become maybe not such a smart way to move forward if it is privatizing a public entity or enterprise into just a privately owned monopoly. Monopoly is whether public or private is not necessarily gonna secure our future in terms of dynamism of our economy. Now, on the left, government procurement, mind you, that's mostly the Scandinavian countries. The citizens pay high taxes, it's 40 to 50%, and the government produces the services that citizens expect the government to produce. So there's no mass migration of the Scandinavian citizens to low tax countries. They stay put in their country and their government delivers. Where there is less, where this is less possible, and maybe because of previous discussions and pressure, the country has drastically reduced the tax levels. Of course, then there won't be enough money to do either government finance or even traditional public procurement because the money is missing. And then comes the question about maybe let's do it through PPPs. Next one. So the question is with PPPs, well, how to go about doing a PPP? Who is gonna be responsible for a big public-private partnership project, which could last 20 years? Some last even 30 years. And here at the bottom, in red, I'd like to highlight an evolution of thinking about what PPPs, how they should be designed. In the past, the value for money was the slogan that everybody understood. Companies have, those who participate in PPPs, they have to make money in order to replenish their capital and in order to survive in the market. No problem about that. However, now, since the arrival of the SDGs in several UN organizations, including the one where I was member of the Bureau of PPPs at UNECE here in Geneva, now more stakeholders say, we want to be sure that a PPP, especially those who cost millions of dollars, that they actually also support achievement of the SDGs. In other words, there should be value for society. And the most recent one goes back to two Spanish colleagues who came up with the suggestion, well, look, PPPs, if we do them today, we who, like the government and us who are maybe in the private sector, we won't have to pay it back because it will be coming up in 20 years' time. It's the young generation will have to be paying back. Is the PPPs that we have in mind supportive of the idea to generate something that will be useful for the young generation? Shouldn't they have a say in where we put enormous amount of money? And that's now the three values, which are cumulative. It's not one against the other. It's clear value for money should still be the case. The companies have to make money, but society should also benefit from that. And also the future generations should be included. Next one. Now, the issue that comes up with the PPPs is the technicalities and the legal implications of PPPs. Here on this slide, you have 9 types of, can we go back to the previous one, please? Yeah, you have 9 kinds of PPPs. I'm not going to read them down. It's just to illustrate that to you, and you probably know some of them. But basically, these acronyms mean something about the legal implications of doing, say, a BTO or a DOT or ROT. Is the product that's going to be produced going to be then owned again by the government at the end, and the company gives it back to the government? Or is the company becoming the new owner under certain conditions that the government makes sure that it would still be providing the services it expects of the company? You see, there are lots of things in it that oftentimes it takes a specialist or an expert to understand the positive and maybe also the more concernful sides of some of these options. Next one. So when we go into the PPPs, we should also ask ourselves in our countries, who knows about PPPs in the sense of these 9 options I showed you in the previous slide? How many people in our national government or local government for that matter know about this before they sign contracts which bind them? How much is this being discussed publicly? How much maybe the government is going to bind itself with a PPP form of agreement that later on, by looking closely, looks not like a very good and smart deal. So normally in the Ministry of Finance, that's where the people are who have a legal background and also a management background, financial background, who are knowledgeable about PPPs. Well, as it is in life, some of them are very good, very competent, and they get hired by the private sector, and the knowledge leaves the office, leaves the department or the ministry. Oftentimes, what I found in the countries where I've been working in, there is no plan for succession. There's no training for the next generation of government officials who know about PPPs. And on top of it also, it's just doesn't make sense to have this knowledge only in the Ministry of Finance, because most of the PPPs mean other line ministries have to implement them. Hence, they should also have some knowledge about it. Next one. So we need to know which ministry should take the lead for whatever PPP we want to do. Is there credibility and competence in the national government? How does civil society look at its government when they make big money commitments for projects that they haven't been able to explain where the benefit is for society? So the interministerial coordination is absolutely crucial, and unfortunately, oftentimes not happening. Ministries don't talk to each other. Maybe it's a coalition government. Some ministries are with this party, other ministries with that party. Some guys or people, including ladies, don't like each other, so they don't talk to each other. The interministerial coordination is crucial and oftentimes inadequate in most of our countries. So PPPs are at risk of not being completed. And mind you, for instance, if you talk to people at the World Bank, they will let you know that when we look at anecdotal evidence, as well as some evaluations, we need much more evaluation of PPPs, but we have a few only. A lot of them fail. So we lose, the risk is we lose money, we lose credibility, we get people upset, and the money is lost. Next one. So let's move away from PPPs and also come to the social impact investment, which our previous speakers also have alluded to, in some, for instance, in terms of the ESGs. What is in red in the middle is what I personally also care about, is that investors should follow impact investing and to consider the company's commitment to corporate social responsibility, or the duty to positively serve society as a whole. In a lot of documents now that I read, from fund managers, ESG is highlighted, and it warms my heart when I hear about what they intend to, how they want to use their funds to encourage a much more sustainable future. Now, there are instruments. Dr. McIntyre mentioned several. Here I just had the two: socially responsible SRI and the environmental, social, and governance ESG. These are two approaches to impact investing, and there's more to that. Next one. Now, I'd like to propose the following. I don't mean to say that it is happening all the time that, you know, well-intentioned CEOs are ousted. Sometimes they just retire, and the next person doesn't have much of a motivation to do much about social impact investment or positive PPPs aiming at SDGs. So it would make sense to look at what are the, let's say, the frameworks we have, and we have already developed, that helps companies and their maybe internal, you know, guide their internal battle about going for profit maximization or to do a bit more of the social impact investment. There are guidelines that are useful. One, I'm sure you have heard about this one, is the guideline, the UN guideline for business and human rights. It goes back to 2011. That was signed by 193 governments. Then we have the OECD guidelines, which goes back to 1976, which has gone to the 4th revision. It is unique in this for two reasons. It has 10 chapters, 10 guidelines, not just business and human rights, which of course is very important, but they also look at what a company is doing or shouldn't do when it comes to, for instance, the dumping of environmental waste, when it comes also to paying taxes, when it comes to these other additional issues, not only human rights issues, that the OECD guidelines are broad. The scope is very interesting. The drawback is it's only 50 countries who have signed up to it. And as you have seen in the previous example, the UN, that means 193 governments. OECD is only 50 governments. However, just one more positive side to it. It is a process where business, that's BIAC, labor, that's TUAC, civil society, that's the OECD Watch, and the governments together in a foursome continuously update and revise the OECD guidelines.
Raymond, we have 5 minutes left at most.
Okay, yeah, so let me close. And we have the ILO, the International Labour Organization, which has its multinational enterprise declaration, which goes back to about the same year when OECD started. It got only revised once. It's, of course, like the UN, it's a much broader membership. The only drawback is it's only on focusing on labor-related issues and human rights. And if in the tripartite system of the ILO, which means the employers, the workers, and the governments together have to agree if there is a claim of wrongdoing of a company, well, if one of the three doesn't agree, then the whole process of remedial action is not possible. I think maybe, John, I would like to maybe end here because there's much more to be said that could be of interest, but I'm sure also Max has plenty of great insights and proposals to share with us. So we could also come back during the discussion later on.
We will have a chance to do that in both the end of session questions and also the far side chat. Raymond, thank you very much. Welcome back to Switzerland, your home base, after a really quite an ordeal at Dallas International Airport. I turn next to Max Bouchet, whom I have known for a very long time. And Max is project manager and senior policy analyst at the Center for Sustainable Development, which is part of the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Max conducts research on building stronger and more inclusive city-region economies, and he co-manages the SDG Leadership Cities Network, which requires him to travel extensively. Every time I talk to him, he's on his way to Buenos Aires or Bonn or Brussels or where else. I don't know. But it's great to have you here. And I know you bring to the table considerable experience with US cities, one of them being Atlanta, where you yourself worked for Conway as a policy analyst for a number of years, and which you know well. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, John. I'm going to share my screen now, and you will tell me if it's visible. Can you see it?
Perfect.
Wonderful. But thank you. It's humbling to follow Dr. Zainer. It's a very tough act to follow, so I will do my best. I'm happy to join from Washington, D.C. Georgia Tech, is really among the universities in the U.S. that have been the most active with the SDGs, and the CIBER Center has also really been a great connector from tech to business, government. It was striking to hear from earlier speakers and practitioners the scale of the challenge, and also this common thread that success on the SDGs will require a whole of society approach to unlock new resources, build better partnerships, keep stakeholders accountable. And I was invited to bring the perspective today of actors that Dr. Zainer was, I think, the first to mention, which are cities and local governments. They play a key role in making progress on the SDGs as spaces where immense challenges happen, but also as actors that will be decisive for success. We know that cities account today for more than 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions and more than half of the population. We saw during the COVID-19 crisis that cities and local governments were often on the front lines of addressing the urgency. So I will give this context and also describe the opportunities that we see of building better partnership between local government and the private sector, but also the challenges of doing so. I thought that would start with a bit of context that will probably be familiar for most of the audience, but maybe a refresher for others. As Dr. McIntyre mentioned earlier, the SDGs were adopted in 2015, and they provide today a roadmap to show what sustainable development looks like. And I think a key novelty of the SDGs when they were adopted is to show that sustainable development is not an issue relevant only for developing or low-income countries, but that is really a continuum of progress that no country has fully attained today, regardless of their income level. And they are relevant, as I will show, for developed countries as well. And unfortunately, the pandemic, COVID-19, has showed the increased relevance of this framework today, because nothing shows the importance of sustainability and inclusion like a global pandemic, with gains lost in education, health, but also deeper inequalities. And the SDGs help us prevent that we don't lock ourselves in the wrong pathways as we recover. John mentioned that when the SDGs were adopted and negotiated in 2015, the United States was a key actor in developing and shaping this agenda. But today, the United States as a country has not fully re-embraced the SDGs as the framework for domestic policy. John mentioned earlier the voluntary national reviews that countries that are committed to the SDGs have to report at the UN. And quite surprisingly, the US is actually one of only 6 countries in the world that have not done so yet, alongside countries like Myanmar, Haiti, or South Sudan. And we know that in the US, there is skepticism over this framework and this branding that come from the United States, from the UN, but there's also quite a level of lack of awareness among the US population about the SDGs. As the US has not yet reported at the national level its progress on the SDGs, a team of colleagues at Brookings actually did so. And they took the framework, they took the indicators that were available and relevant for the US and looked at, well, what did it look like? And as you can see on this chart, there are, some of it is promising, but we're also seeing some really dire challenges that reveal the relevance of using the SDGs to identify gaps for US domestic policy. So we see here that this analysis was able to organize the indicators of the SDGs in 4 categories. And here we see that for 75% of the trajectories analyzed pre-pandemic, the US have to reverse trends that were moving in the wrong direction or greatly alter its approach to reach the targets by 2030. We see that the US is actually moving backward or making very slow progress on issues related to health, education, justice, and there are flashing red warning signs on the future status and well-being of certain specific demographics, America's youth, women, minority groups, with persistent gaps on basic measures of human development. As an example, 6.6 million Americans lacked access to safe sanitation, which is a population roughly equal to the entire state of Indiana. Think also about the digital divide. We estimate that 42 million Americans lack broadband connection access today. And this to show that the SDGs are highly relevant for the US as well. But while the United States as a country at the federal level has not fully embraced the agenda, we see strong leadership on the SDGs emerging from other segments of the US society. And my research was focused on elevating this leadership. And I want to give credit here to cities in the US, but as well abroad. We've seen the extent to which a global movement of mayors, of local leaders, without anyone asking them to, have used and adopted the SDGs as a framework for their own scale and context. An interesting example of innovations here is around what we call the voluntary local review. You remember, as we mentioned, countries have to report to the UN their progress, but we see now more and more cities, more than 100 around the world, and about 5 so far in the US, reporting voluntarily their progress on a range of SDGs relevant for their local context. And when you look at this, suddenly the SDGs, are very concrete. It's not an abstract set of indicators, but you see locally the gaps, the issues, the need for better partnerships that are revealed by these analyses. So a word on the research and how we approached it. We've built a network of vanguard cities around the world, including a few from the US, but it was very important to compare and contrast lessons and experiences between cities in different environments. We brought as well cities from the African continent, from Latin America, Western Europe, and Asia, to really understand what happens on the ground. What does success look like? what are the challenges, what are the partners and stakeholders that need to be brought in local strategies to deliver and make progress on the SDGs. And we've built tools and methods out of it that I'll be happy to share with anyone interested offline. But I just wanted to share a few very high-level key findings from this research before speaking about the role of the private sector. First, we see, we try to capture what does a local SDG effect look like for cities that are using the SDGs. First, we see cities mapping their existing plans and priorities and strategies to the comprehensive SDG framework to again identify gaps and make potential shifts in policies and inform the way they are understanding local challenges. And we are seeing here innovative ways to do so. New York City, for instance, did this, mapping their current plans to the SDGs, but as well cities like Buenos Aires using the SDGs as a lens to review their existing policies. And during COVID-19, you know, when local leaders were faced with the urgency of the day-to-day response, but also now, you know, during the recovery, as they are faced with the pressure for the dash for growth to quickly recover, the SDGs, you know, help balance the short but also long-term views on development. We're also seeing, you know, in terms of political priorities, cities using the SDGs to really steer and allocate resources next to their commitments, using the SDGs to inform budgeting or to inform procurement. More and more cities, for instance, like Bristol in the UK, are using what we call the social value index, where they are ranking and assessing private businesses based on their social value and their ability to meet the SDGs when those cities are making decisions to allocate procurement contracts, for instance. Here, a side note, we mentioned the SDG branding and the fact that there is sometimes skepticism or there's just so many frameworks out there. We see many cities, you know, not necessarily using the branding overtly to communicate using the SDGs, but at least they use the SDGs, they use the discipline that is behind the framework. They use the data and metrics to strengthen, for instance, evidence-based policymaking. We see cities using the indicators to publicly report to their residents through, for instance, a data dashboard, their progress on the SDGs. These are really extremely useful tools for cities, but also for residents, for voters as well, for businesses, to see, you know, those open source data that are databases that are aligned to the SDGs. But one of the key value added from using the SDGs was colleagues from LA told us recently that the single most important value from the framework was its ability to provide a common language to build partnerships with other actors that are using that same framework and language. And here, the SDGs, you know, provide this common platform that enables universities, philanthropy, you know, community foundations in the US play a big role here, but businesses as well, you know, using this common language to align resources and better cooperate. Final point on the value is around that long-term horizon. You know, I mentioned again this pressure that local leaders are faced, you know, to quickly recover, provide economic growth, provide job opportunities, which are critically important goals that are actually part of the framework of the SDGs, but also balance this with these intergenerational changes that are required to achieve the SDGs. And there are immense challenges here. I think Raymond mentioned one earlier around, you know, the political cycles, you know, that governments, national and local, go through, where suddenly the priorities might change when a new government comes in power. There is, of course, the economic pressure that cities also faced. And cities are developing innovative ways to mainstream the framework in long-term policy. I mentioned budgeting, for instance, procurement, so that their commitments remain stable and consistent over time. And here, partnerships with external stakeholders are critically important. And we heard earlier the growing commitments from businesses to advance social outcomes while pursuing commercial interest. And here we see very promising examples of collaboration at the local level between the private and the public sector. For instance, in New York City, the Equitable Commuting Program is providing access to financing for frontline workers in New York. Think about nurses, delivery people, to purchase e-bikes and e-scooters, for instance, connecting New Yorkers to discounted e-bikes and accessible financing from banks. These are extremely difficult partnerships to develop. And we, as it was mentioned earlier by Raymond, failures happen very often. And we heard recently an example from colleagues working in Mexico City who were planning to electrify annually part of their pool of taxis, which is a great opportunity to every year retire all taxis and replace them with electrical vehicles. And here, the city government of Mexico City explored partnership with automotive manufacturers that had SDG commitments. And yet, even with offering to those manufacturers this captured market of vehicle replacement, the perception of high risks and low returns from the business perspective hindered the development of that project. And so here, a key lesson that we heard was that finding alignment that works for both parties and building long-term relationships between the local government and the private sector. A good example of how best to approach this cultivation of trust and relationship between cities, local government, and the private sector comes from Hawaii. In Hawaii, the Sustainable Development Strategy of the state is managed and delivered by Hawaii Green Growth, which is a public-private partnership that brings together governments, counties, cities, the private sector, and the civil society together to shape the state's strategy and build data indicators, metrics in cooperation, but also develop pipelines of projects that are investment ready, that serve the purpose of the state strategy, but that are also, again, designed in a way that is operational for the private sector. And this, requires both informal and formal structures. Hawaii created a sustainability business forum, which brings together, again, this public-private partnership, but also 27 CEOs of the largest companies in Hawaii, brings them together regularly, again, to facilitate cooperation, connections, and deliver on the state's strategy. And it's critical here to create ease of entry for potential investors to invest and contribute to the local SDG strategy. And here we have other examples from Bristol, for instance, which launched a Bristol City Fund, which is a mixed funding mechanism that provides loans, grants, mixed financing, aligned with the SDGs. But again, based on a governance model that reflects the interconnectedness of the SDGs. And in Bristol, Bristol has developed boards of public and private leaders that, again, meet regularly to align their priorities and, again, make sure that communication and understanding, is aligned. I will stop here with, again, this idea that the SDGs provide that common language across sectors that can facilitate the development of these partnerships. And I'll be happy to share offline some additional resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Max, for a very compelling presentation on what's going on at the grassroots level. We have a few questions, and I'd like to turn it to direct one of my questions, if I may, to Raymond first. What is your sense of progress between now, 2022, and 2030, which is the target date for implementation of the Paris Accord agenda? Where are we? And then secondarily, where will we go after that? Because the original SDGs of 2015 find their roots in the millennial goals of 2000, inspired, by the way, some people may not know that, by President George Bush Jr. at the time. So Raymond, if you want to have a crack at it, it's a tough question. It puts you on the spot.
That question probably will be a 1 hour response.
2 minutes.
Well, where are we now? Well, I was in New York two weeks ago, where we had the annual presentations of countries and the discussions where we are and where we hopefully will be moving towards. There is a bit of floating, may I say it this way, there's too much going on, from the war in the Ukraine and COVID and poverty re-emerging and food problems, and the political situation about some of our leaders. What is really needed, I think, is to build more what Max was suggesting, to ally ourselves with the cities who made commitments to move forward, no matter who is the president. And I think we need more of this international cooperation to keep the glue still, make it still possible to talk to each other and to cooperate, because all of this doesn't make sense if some continents do not implement the SDGs. Like the simple example is pollution or CO2 emissions, climate change. And we know some are laggards, some either don't want to do much about it or don't know what to do about it. So what I would say is we need to excel as much in making alliances, and to make the alliances that involves business and civil society. At the moment, we have a few great positive examples about SDG implementation, but there aren't that many. So my concern is more that we should, if the governments, for whatever reason, cannot lead or are busy with other things, we as a society and the business together, we should just keep up the flame. And what comes after 2030, that's a bit looking into the crystal ball. I think it will depend if, to be blunt, if we have a major war, the world will look very different, and we will need other additional initiatives to keep the world together. That's my attempt to be within the 3-minute limits.
I turn to Max. You have given us some of the leading demonstration projects at the local level, showing the way perhaps to national governments. Looking at the United States specifically, and I think you have focused on 5 cities, can you elaborate on a little more on those demonstration projects that stand out of the landscape and provide an incentive and a learning impetus?
Sure. Thank you, John. I mean, again, as you mentioned earlier, those cities and local governments in the US are innovating, showing leadership on sustainable development, again, without anyone in any other level of government, asking them to do so. So I think it's important to give credit to them. And you're right that they operate in an environment that is not necessarily very supportive. It's important also to note that those cities and governments in the US that are acting on the SDGs are showing the way for many other cities and governments in the world. There is this realm of cooperation and exchanges that is happening at the subnational level, with tremendous exchanges that are happening in city networks. And here, cities like New York City and LA, but again, also cities that might be less obvious, Pittsburgh, Orlando, are extremely active in sharing these lessons and innovations and learning from other cities around the world. As some really striking maybe lessons that I would share, one is that this leadership comes from places and segments of society that you might not expect. I mean, you would, but for instance, universities. We see universities in the US embracing the framework and reporting their own progress at the university level on the SDGs. And here's the example of the University of Central Florida or Carnegie Mellon as well, are developing very interesting case and model there. On data, I mentioned Los Angeles, which was really the first city to build an open source data dashboard that showcases and reports in a transparent way the city's progress and sometimes the lack of progress, because it's also about truth and transparency to their residents and any other cities. In terms of governance, the example of Orlando really comes to mind. Orlando and Central Florida has built what they call a resilience regional collaborative, which really looks at sustainable development at the regional level, which is really the functional scale for sustainable development, building relationships between counties that might be of, by the way, different political affiliation, with community foundations, with businesses as well, to build again that regional platform. I have a few others, but I'll stop here.
Well, we have come to the end. It was short. I did want to mention in passing to underline the importance of local cities, but also the role of corporate structures, particularly multinational. We've just come out with a book. I would encourage you to acquire it. It's called The Role of Multinational Enterprise in Supporting the United Nations SDGs. It just came out in the UK last week. Will be out in the US any day. We will eventually do a book presentation by webinar in coming weeks to highlight the findings of that particular study. So let me thank both of you, Max and Raymond. Please stay on, be prepared with your questions for an open discussion. We are all asking questions, and Annie, I will let you conduct the last fireside session, and I will be there providing all necessary ammunitions and support.